Now, a conversation about if a player is overrated is always guaranteed to get hostile, no matter how reasonable or factual somebody's take about a player being that way is. People just are passionate about this and inherently see the word overrated as an insult. And while I don't think it's an insult as much as it is a characterization of somebody's hype compared to their playing ability, there are undoubtedly players in the AFC North specifically that are overrated and underrated. So what I want to do over the course of the next 2 days is talk about the most over and underrated players. And I'm going to start by talking about the AFC North's most overrated players today, and then tomorrow I'm going to talk about the most underrated. But let's start with the most overrated right now. Real quick before I get into it, please make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and ding that notification bell. We're trying to get to 20K before the season starts. Hopefully we can get there, and we can get there with your help. Also, you're going to want to be subscribed and notified because a ton of content is going to come out when camp heats up after August 14th, so you're going to want to be locked and loaded somewhere. Please choose here. But without further ado, let's jump into the most overrated players in the AFC North, and I'm going to start with the Baltimore Ravens. Now, the Baltimore Ravens are, quite frankly, a hard team to find somebody who's overrated because, quite frankly, I don't think they have a ton of overrated players on their roster. I think they give credit where credit is due or get credit where credit is due, and they have their flaws where those flaws are. And as much as people hate on Lamar Jackson, he was the MVP last year, and he should be nowhere near a overrated conversation anymore. So who did I pick to be the Baltimore Ravens' most overrated player so far this offseason? Hollywood Brown. Now, in some circles, this may come as a surprise because you probably haven't heard much about Hollywood Marquise Brown, the former first-round pick out of Baltimore. But if you know as many Ravens fans, if I have the pleasure of knowing, then you would know that this is completely warranted because Marquise Hollywood Brown has been getting an insane amount of hype over this offseason. People are predicting insane breakouts for him, saying that he's going to be a Tyreek Hill type player this year, and I just don't see it with Marquise Hollywood Brown. I get that he's bulked up. I get that he's worked on his route running. I get that he's done all of these things, but that's what most second-year players do. If we look at his first year where he was the number one option in the wide receiving core in Baltimore, he put up numbers that Juju Smith-Schuster were, quite frankly, ridiculed for having with 584 yards and 71 targets. Now, he did have 7 touchdowns. And that's very good for a rookie. And he got him in very good situations. He made some very good plays. I'm not saying he's not a very talented player, but I think his ceiling is a lot lower than what some people are assuming right now of Marquise Brown. I think Marquise Brown is going to be a fringe 1,000-yard guy, but he's going to produce in that 500 to 700-yard radius. And where I get in a lot of disagreements about where I see Marquise Brown is his ceiling, because I think his ceiling is a Ted Ginn-like player, a guy who's never going to anchor your offense, a guy who's not going to be a clear number one in a good to great offense as far as wide receivers go, but he's a guy who can fill in quite nice. He can get you 500 to 800 yards a year. He can get you some touchdowns. He can get you space over the top, and he can get the odd 1,000-yard year in his career. He's a good player, not a great player, and I would say that's his ceiling, is Ted Ginn Jr. Now, I could be completely wrong on this. He could be Tyreek Hill. I personally don't see it right now in August 10th of 2020. I don't see it as much as a bunch of other people do. Now, who are the honorable mentions for the Baltimore Ravens? One is Marcus Peters. Now, Marcus Peters played very well last year, and that's why he's not the most overrated player on this list. I think he had a better year than Hollywood Brown had and kind of warrants some of the hype that he has, but I think people have forgotten there's a reason why Marcus Peters has gotten traded all the time in his NFL career. And it's not just because of his off-the-field stuff. It's mainly because of the on-the-field stuff. And that is because Marcus Peters can be insanely inconsistent at times. And I think Baltimore got good Marcus Peters last year. Congratulations to them. But let's not forget, Bad Marcus Peters is definitely a thing, and I don't think it's going anywhere because it's shown itself to be a trend throughout his career. This doesn't mean that Marcus Peters is going to stink on every snap. No, it just means every once in a while Marcus Peters makes some questionable decisions when trying to defend routes. Now, he has Marlon Humphreys behind him, which is very good, but also this goes to the core of my reasoning for Marcus Peters being overrated, is because people think he's better than Marlon Humphreys, and that's just ridiculous to me that Marcus Peters is better than Marlon Humphreys. He's more known than Marlon Humphreys, but better? That's a little ridiculous. Now, this brings me to the second guy who, honestly, throughout most of his career has been underrated, but for whatever reason this summer, people decided to drop a flatbed full of flowers at his front door to apologize for all of the underratedness that they said he was throughout his career. And now I think it's gone a little bit too far, and that's Calais Campbell. There's the Madden rating that made him the best player on the Ravens, which was ridiculous. There was the top 100 ranking that put him ahead of Myles Garrett, which is a little bit ridiculous. Again, Calais Campbell's a good player. He's going to be a difference maker on that defensive line, and he's going to be a big reason why Baltimore might be able to stop the run a lot better than they did last year. But is he that good? Is he better than Myles Garrett? Is he the best player on the Ravens? Not even close. It's gotten a little bit ridiculous in that side of the spectrum, so it needs to be brought back a little bit. But again, Calais Campbell, really good player. Now, the Browns are an interesting one because this team and this roster, honestly, is so scrutinized, especially on this channel, that it's hard to say that anybody is really over or underrated. I feel like people are kind of on the fence with the Cleveland Browns and kind of don't go one direction or the other. So it kind of means that everybody's neutral on the Browns, which means that, nobody's really over or underrated. There are people who think Odell's going to have a breakout year. There are people who think what Odell did last year is more characteristic of what he's going to do this year. But neither of those opinions are really outrageous or over or underrating Odell Beckham. But when it comes to one player that is overrated slightly, in my opinion, is Larry Ogunjobi. Now, the reason I think this is because I don't think people are honest enough about his inability to be a factor in the run game, especially on the inside. He is a good player. He can get to the quarterback. He looks physically impressive. Every time they put a picture out, I really want to believe he can stop the run, but it just never happens. And this has happened year after year. He was supposed to make that step 2 years ago. He didn't. A year ago, he didn't. Last season, he didn't. So I start to question whether this is something he's physically capable of. Maybe he's just a guy you can put in there on the rotation to get to the quarterback. And I think the Browns had that idea in getting Andrew Billings. But with him opting out, Larry Ogunjobi's the guy now at defensive tackle, and he's going to have to be a 3-down defensive tackle. And I hope he can prove me wrong, because that would solve a lot of problems the Browns have with the current structure of the roster. But I just don't think it's going to happen. Again, I don't think Larry Ogunjobi is a guy who can stop the inside run. I've made a ton of videos about this over the summer, so check those out. But that's why Larry Ogunjobi is my most overrated Brown, just because there are a lot of people who still believe in him to be this 3-down solution, when I think it's just abundantly clear he's not. Another guy I would put on honorable mention is Baker Mayfield. Now, when you're evaluating this just based off of what the hype is for 2020, I kind of think he's a little underrated, because I think people have gone a little bit too far in trashing him, but he does still carry that stench of 2019 on him. And when you were the most overrated quarterback of last season, I don't think it's fair to just drag you into the underrated conversation. I think you should still live in that overrated conversation, because he was so ridiculously overrated last year. And I'm guilty of doing this. A lot of people are guilty of doing this with Baker Mayfield. He was insanely overrated last year. Although I think that it's really trending in the direction of being so harsh on the overrated side that he's actually starting to become underrated. And the next guy I have in there is Mack Wilson. Now, Mack Wilson is a player I like, a player I think is going to be very good for the Browns, but I think fans are setting themselves up for a little bit of a disappointment. This is still a guy who I think is 2 years away from really being at the zenith of what he could be. And also, I think people have a higher ideal of what he could be than what I think is reality from Mack Wilson. I think if you're thinking Mack Wilson could be like a Joe Schobert type player, like that good, you're right on the mark. If you're thinking that Mack Wilson could be like Darius Leonard, we got a conversation that needs to be had. I don't think Mack Wilson has those type of instincts or is that kind of a playmaker. I think he has a ton of potential. I think he can be a Pro Bowl level linebacker, but I don't think he's going to be that level of a difference maker that a Darius Leonard has the potential of being. And I think that's where the overrating is happening. I think there's fans are saying that Mack Wilson himself makes up for the deficiencies so far in the linebacking room. And, you know, while I appreciate the spirit, I don't agree with the sentiment at all. I don't think Mack Wilson is that good, and I think thinking he's going to be that good is setting up the Browns for a major disappointment when it comes to how this roster is structured out. I think Mack Wilson needs a lot more help than people are giving credit for. The Bengals are also a very tough one to talk about overrated, right? Because who in the world is overrating the Cincinnati Bengals right now? Like, the stock is buy low right now on the Cincinnati Bengals. Sure, you got some guys, some names that might get a little bit more press, but anybody mentioned on this overrated section for the Cincinnati Bengals kind of gets an asterisk because they're not horribly overhyped or horribly overrated or talked about a lot. Even Joe Burrow, who has a ton of press, is not talked about a ton or more than he warrants because he was the first pick of this draft and did have a fantastic college football season last year. So he doesn't deserve to just fall into oblivion. And it's kind of feels mean to make these designations for a team that a lot of the players who have been playing good football feel like they fell into oblivion a long time ago. So take this with a grain of salt, but I think Joe Mixon's the most overrated player on the Cincinnati Bengals. Joe is good. Joe's a good running back. I don't think Joe is a great or a top tier running back. He can do a lot of things. He's a starter. He's a 3-down back. He is one of the NFL's top 15 running backs. But if you're talking about a top 10 conversation, that's where I have a little bit of a trouble with where you're ranking Joe Mixon. And it's difficult to have this conversation with Cincinnati Bengals fans because Joe Mixon just doesn't get a ton of press. He's put up good numbers in 2 years and feel like nobody's talking about him, and they feel like he's horribly underrated. And they have some gripes there that are legitimate. He does not get talked about enough. He does not get the hype that you would think a guy like that would get that's that versatile. But there's a reason why he's not talked about so much is because the numbers aren't really that amazing when you look at him on some of the averages. His rushing production, specifically his yards per carry numbers, just aren't impressive. When you have running backs in this division that are getting over 5 yards per carry easily with a ton of carries, it kind of makes people look at you sideways when you haven't been able to break that mark in 3 years in Cincinnati. And I think to be in the conversation for one of the great running backs in the NFL, you need to at least break that marker when it comes to yards per carry. Also, his touches went up last year, but his production as far as yards and touchdowns went down, which is concerning because it's not like that offensive line was amazing last year or the year before, so you can't really blame it on that. The other honorable mentions for the Cincinnati Bengals is Joe Burrow, just because he hasn't played yet, but people are already predicting that he's going to pull the franchise around, which I understand the optimism there. I'm not really going to poo-poo on that too much. I get it. I like Joe Burrow a lot. Maybe they're putting too much on his shoulders. I could see that argument being made clearly there. Geno Atkins is also somebody I think is starting to be a little bit overrated because nobody has talked about how his production just fell off a cliff last year. Like, he was not anywhere near close to being Geno Atkins of old. And I think that's going to be a trend that's going to start to show itself to be stable going forward. So I think Geno Atkins, as far as thinking he's still Geno Atkins, is a little bit in the past. Also, I think Joe Burrow, just a little bit too much hype for Joe Burrow. Now, while the other 3 teams were kind of hard to find these overrated players, for the most part, people are reasonable about what they think of those 3 teams. The one team I don't understand why people just get real unreasonable about, and I'm not just talking about Steeler fans, because we know nobody loves their own propaganda than Steeler fans. Like, I'm not even really factoring how they feel into this conversation. I'm talking about the larger picture of people who talk NFL. They just believe in this Pittsburgh team as if they are Bill Belichick in the New England Patriots, like never count them out. And I'm starting to wonder how warranted that is and how much I should just ignore my general common sense when looking at some of the pieces on this roster in order to award them that. Because if you're talking about overhyped or overrated players coming into this season, it gets no better than Ben Roethlisberger this year. You know, I've heard the sentiment, right? The Steelers have a really good defense and Big Ben is coming back off injury, so they're going to be a really good team this year. They're going to challenge for the division. And while that sentiment might sound good on paper, are we serious? Are we seriously expecting a 38-year-old Ben Roethlisberger who's coming off of surgery on his throwing arm to just come back like ain't nothing happened, to play like he did 2 years ago when he was healthy? Although there are some reports that he was not healthy for that second game. But when he was healthy against New England for the first game, he looked like pure garbage. And I know Steeler fans are going to tell me, well, Ben always looks like garbage before the season starts. And to me, that's like saying that, hey, look, you know, I know when I start my car up, it smokes a lot and my check engine light goes on. But if I drive it for a little while longer, the light just turns off. So I think the car is fine. No, your car is about to die. You just haven't come to grips with that situation yet. And that's why I think Pittsburgh fan, not even just Pittsburgh fan, but the larger media is with this whole Ben Roethlisberger situation. What about this Ben Roethlisberger situation? If you take the name off of the back of the jersey, if you take the name off of the helmet, tells you that this is good. 38-year-old quarterback coming off of elbow surgery, also a quarterback who the rest of the quarterbacks in that draft class, although they were healthier than Big Ben has ever been in his career, also took care of their body much better than Big Ben has ever been in his career. Those guys both fell off a cliff. Those guys are both done in their NFL careers, respectively. I mean, some people think Phillip Rivers might make a comeback, but Eli Manning's retired and Phillip Rivers looked done last year. So, and there's not much you can blame that on because that team went to the playoffs the year before. So when it comes to Big Ben, who's been injured more than all those guys, who's missed more games than all those guys, and who has had the most questionable fitness habits of all those guys, everybody just thinks it's going to be okay that he's coming off of elbow surgery on his throwing arm. And why do they think it's okay? Why do they think everything's going to be fine? Because Big Ben lost weight. So, you know, forget the surgery. He lost 10 pounds. So he's going to be the most amazing quarterback you ever seen. He's going to be back to 2018 Ben Roethlisberger. I think that's a little ridiculous, right? I think it's more likely that he does not return to 2018 form or even anything resembling 2018 form than it is that he does. Like, and I think that's where the conversation starts with the Big Ben and the Steelers, is if he can come back, not when he comes back. So that's my big gripe with the Steelers, how overrated this conversation is with Ben Roethlisberger. Now, as far as honorable mention goes, this is going to upset people. I already know. I'm going to get a lashing in the comment section for saying that these two players are even close to overrated because people are passionate about these two players. People really think these two players are defensive player of the year candidates, and I just don't think they're that good. I think they're really good. I don't think they played at a two defensive player of the year candidate level on defense last year, and that's Minkah Fitzpatrick and TJ Watt. And here's why. One, I think Minkah Fitzpatrick's presence on that defense has been a little bit overstated. Did he help the Steelers defense become much better? Absolutely. I'm not going to deny that. But I think the conversation is less, is Minkah Fitzpatrick the person who made that defense great, or is Minkah Fitzpatrick being above a negative replacement level player at that position what helped fill the gaps for that Steelers defense? I think there's a lot more pieces around that Steelers defense that don't get the credit that they deserve, and it all kind of funnels to these two guys in Minkah Fitzpatrick and TJ Watt. I think a lot of love gets taken away from guys like Cam Hayward and Joe Hayden, where that love kind of deserves to be spread out more because people think that Minkah is the reason they were good. I think it's just the fact that they got somebody who could be a starting level player at the bare minimum and a good player, you know, at the top of the thing. Now, TJ Watt, he put in work last year, and he's a Watt brother, so he's going to get overhyped if he has any success because we love those kind of stories. So I understand why he's hyped. I just think the narrative last year that this defense had two defensive player of the year candidates was ridiculous, and it continues to go on till this season. Because if you have a defense that has 2 Defensive Player of the Year candidates, explain to me how you lose to the Jets when you need a win in the playoffs. Explain to me how you allow the Baltimore Ravens to beat you without Lamar Jackson, without Mark Ingram, without their starting offensive line, without Mark Andrews, without all of those guys, and RG3 behind the helm. This defense that had 2 Defensive Player of the Year candidates couldn't get past a second-tier offensive line and couldn't take advantage of a aged RG3 in the pass game. I just don't think that's the stuff of 2 Defensive Player of the Year candidate defenses. I think the only defense that has legitimately had that gripe over the years is the Baltimore Ravens when they had Ed Reed and Ray Lewis, among many other players who are amazing on those defenses. I just don't think the gripe is legitimate with Pittsburgh, and I think they have overrated these 2 very good players by doing so. But that's my thoughts on the most overrated players in the AFC North. Just try to keep it civil down in the comment section. I know it's going to be a wild conversation there. But again, guys, thank you guys for watching. Have a great day and have a good night.